Moments before the nation gathered to honor Queen Elizabeth II, an order from King Charles III tore through the palace like thunder. Courtiers whispered, aides froze, and Queen Camilla herself was left pale and speechless. The command was final. She was forbidden to attend the late Queen's memorial. What could drive a husband to publicly ban his own wife from Britain's most sacred royal event? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began as a quiet morning inside Buckingham Palace, but within minutes, the atmosphere turned suffocating. A sealed document, bearing the king's signature, had arrived in the hands of the private secretary. The moment it was opened, silence gripped the corridors. Those who read it didn't dare speak. The order was blunt and absolute. Queen Camilla was to be excluded from the memorial honoring Queen Elizabeth II. There was no explanation, no justification, just the undeniable command of a monarch. The ripple effect was instant. Senior aides exchanged nervous glances, debating whether to intervene. One hesitated, whispering that this could trigger a public scandal the crown might not survive. Another reminded him, "You do not stop a king when he has made up his mind." And with that, the letter was dispatched to Clarence House, where Camilla's world would soon collapse. When the message reached her, those present described her reaction as disbelief layered over heartbreak. She read the words twice, her lips trembling, then looked up in stunned silence. The woman who had endured decades of scrutiny, gossip, and judgment had thought she had finally earned her place beside her husband in both love and duty. But that illusion shattered in an instant. Her disbelief quickly turned to fury. "He can't mean this," she said, pacing, as courtiers tried to calm her. Yet deep down, she knew Charles meant every word. For weeks, tension between them had been growing quietly, dangerously. Conversations about the memorial had turned into arguments about legacy, loyalty, and the Queen's lasting influence. Camilla had sensed something shifting in Charles, something colder, as if the memory of his mother had begun to consume the man she once knew. Behind closed doors, the king sat alone in his study, surrounded by silence heavy enough to drown in. Those close to him would later say that his decision came not from impulse, but from a burden he had carried since his mother's passing. The late Queen's shadow loomed large over him, and the memorial had become more than a tribute. It was a spiritual test. He could not bear the thought of her presence being tainted by controversy or disapproval, even from beyond the grave. And in his mind, Camilla represented both love and betrayal, devotion and defiance. Every look, every memory of her, pulled him between his heart and his conscience. That morning, conscience won. As words spread through the palace, whispers filled every corridor. One phrase in particular escaped from an aide and made its way into the press. "She's not worthy of my mother's presence." When the tabloids published those words, the monarchy trembled. To the public, it sounded like cruelty. To insiders, it was a revelation. The king had finally given voice to the battle raging within him. Media outlets scrambled to make sense of it. Some framed it as a private disagreement. Others called it the beginning of a royal collapse. And through it all, the silence from the palace only deepened the mystery. For the royal staff, this was more than just a scandal, it was déjà vu. They had seen it before, decades earlier, when another woman had been excluded from the royal narrative. Now, it seemed history was repeating itself, wrapped in new names but the same sorrow. To them, the king's decision was not spontaneous, it was destiny fulfilling itself. Old wounds had resurfaced, secrets had been awakened. By nightfall, the world was watching Buckingham Palace with anxious eyes. The flags were still, but inside, hearts were in turmoil. Advisors feared that the monarchy's fragile unity might shatter once again. Yet even as the storm gathered, Charles remained unmoved. His order stood firm, carved in silence and sorrow. For Camilla, the exclusion felt like exile. For Charles, it was penance. As the world speculated about a royal rift, those close to the throne knew this wasn't a sudden act. It was the result of wounds that had never healed. Even in death, Queen Elizabeth's presence commanded absolute obedience. To Charles, the memorial wasn't just a ceremony. It was a test of loyalty to his mother's memory. But to Camilla, it was her rightful place as queen consort. Between love and legacy stood the shadow of a monarch who never truly accepted her. In the weeks leading up to the memorial, the ghost of Queen Elizabeth seemed to hover over every decision Charles made. Every word he spoke, every hesitation he carried, was measured against her invisible expectations. To the public, the king appeared composed and dutiful. But behind the palace doors, her voice, her guidance, and the unspoken weight of her approval haunted him. Advisors urged him to move forward with grace, to show unity and compassion. Yet, deep inside, Charles knew this day was not about modern monarchy or reconciliation. It was about loyalty, his final chance to prove to himself that he had not betrayed the woman who shaped him, ruled before him, and, even in death, overshadowed him. Pressure mounted as royal courtiers whispered reminders of the late queen's wishes. Old letters surfaced, said to have been written by Elizabeth herself, instructing her son to protect the dignity of the crown above personal comfort. One passage, in particular, unsettled him. "When my time comes, honor me with truth, not appearances." Those words pierced through his heart. What did truth mean in this context? To him, it meant purity of legacy, something that could not be shared with controversy, no matter how much love it cost him. And for those closest to him, that truth had a face in Camilla's. As the days passed, the divide between them deepened. Camilla saw the memorial as a moment of closure, a gesture of respect to the woman whose legacy she had promised to preserve. But others within the royal circle saw it differently. They accused her of overstepping, of trying to rewrite history in a space that did not belong to her. Long-serving courtiers reminded Charles of the Queen's strict devotion to traditional rituals that Camilla had quietly altered, customs she'd simplified, appearances she had chosen not to attend. These gestures, once dismissed as minor, now took on the tone of rebellion. It was whispered that Elizabeth had predicted that she had known. The balance between duty and desire in her son's life would someday crumble under the weight of its own contradiction. Even William and Princess Anne entered the discussion cautiously, walking a line between support and silent dissent. Anne, pragmatic as ever, told Charles in confidence, "Do what feels right, not what feels kind." William's approach was softer, but no less deliberate. He reminded his father that the monarchy thrived on perception, not sentiment. His words echoed his grandmother's philosophy, and Charles could not ignore the resemblance. The pressure was suffocating two of his most trusted family members urging him to honor the Queen's legacy in a way that would wound the woman he loved. Then came the rumors that Elizabeth had left behind a final warning for her son, one that mentioned consequences if trust is broken. No one could verify its authenticity, but the effect was immediate. The phrase spread across the palace like wildfire. For Charles, it wasn't simply gossip, it felt like prophecy. He began to view his life as a series of trials, set by his mother, and this memorial was the ultimate test. To allow Camilla's presence, he feared, would be to dishonor the Queen's memory. To forbid it, however, would break his marriage beyond repair. Outside, the public began drawing eerie parallels. Newspapers recalled another royal woman who had once been excluded, another memorial marked by absence. First Diana, now Camilla. The headlines read, as if history itself was determined to repeat its cruel rhythm. For a man trying to redefine his reign, the comparisons were unbearable. The ghost of his past, his lost wife, his mother's judgment, and his wife's humiliation merged into one unending nightmare. Every sound within the palace reminded Charles of her. Every decision he made seemed shadowed by her watchful gaze. Those who saw him in those final days before the ceremony said his silence spoke louder than words. He was a king at war with two loyalties, one to the woman who made him who he was, and another to the woman who stood beside him when no one else would. Yet, in his mind, the two could never coexist. He would have to choose, and the world would soon see which voice guided the king's heart. But beneath this clash of duty and emotion lay a deeper truth, one tied to a secret promise Charles made long before his coronation. Before Queen Elizabeth drew her final breath, Charles sat beside her in Windsor's quiet chamber. What she whispered that night would bind him forever and make Camilla his greatest regret. It was a mother's plea, and a monarch's command rolled into one. Protect the crown, even if it means sacrificing love. It was a night draped in silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words ever could. In those final moments, the Queen's strength had waned, but her mind remained sharp. Charles, standing at the precipice of his destiny, sat beside her, his hands cold, his heart heavy. They had shared many moments of tenderness over the years, but none as intimate as this. Alone in that quiet chamber, Elizabeth's voice cracked with the weight of years spent building a kingdom, a legacy that she knew would outlast her. "Promise me, Charles," she whispered, her frailty making the words more piercing. "Promise me you will protect the crown, even if it means sacrificing love." The room seemed to hold its breath as the future king absorbed his mother's final command. His promise to her was unspoken, but in that moment, it carved itself into his soul. What Elizabeth had never shared, what she could never bring herself to say outright, was her distrust of Camilla. Despite her son's unwavering devotion, the Queen had always felt that Camilla, in her pursuit of the crown, threatened the very essence of the monarchy. It was a truth that Elizabeth never voiced in public, but it simmered beneath the surface of every royal gathering, every decision Charles made. She feared that Camilla's ambitions were not just personal, they were political, and that, in the end, her influence would undermine everything Elizabeth had built. For the Queen, Camilla's rise represented something much darker than love. It was the erosion of tradition, the breaking of a sacred line. Charles, torn between the woman he loved and the mother he revered, had stood at the crossroads of duty and devotion for years. But in that moment, as his mother's final words sank in, the weight of his responsibility became undeniable. His heart, which had once known only the warmth of Camilla's embrace, now felt the coldness of duty. Elizabeth's death sealed the fate of that bond, as Charles swore, with his mother's final breath, to uphold the legacy she had crafted, no matter the cost. But Camilla, unaware of the secret vow Charles had made, continued her fight for a place at his side, determined to rise as the Queen consort in her own right. It was through a small, innocuous diary entry leaked to the press months later that Camilla learned of the promise. The words hit her like a blade to the chest. "The crown above all, this is my vow, and my only loyalty." To her, it was not merely a breach of trust, it was betrayal. How could the man she had supported through countless scandals and trials now turn away from her, pulled into a world of royal duty she had never fully embraced? The love that once bound them had been torn apart by an invisible thread, one that had been woven in the shadows of the palace, hidden from her eyes. Charles, once open and affectionate, began to shift. Advisors whispered of his growing coldness toward Camilla, a formality taking root where there had once been warmth. He began to withdraw, consumed by the promise he had made to his mother, unable to reconcile it with his love for the woman who had shared his life. Those who had once seen the king as a man capable of great passion now saw a ruler who had traded his heart for his crown. It wasn't just a personal transformation, it was a public one. The man who had defied the world for love was now the man who stood silently before the expectations of the throne. And when Camilla tried to reclaim her place beside him, she unknowingly triggered the very vow that sealed her downfall. The more she pushed for recognition, the more Charles retreated into the rigid walls of royal duty. Every gesture of affection felt like a hollow promise. Every word exchanged seemed to only drive them further apart. As the king's heart grew colder, the very love that had once united them began to fracture. And when Camilla tried to reclaim her place beside him, she unknowingly triggered the very vow that sealed her downfall. In the gilded halls of Clarence House, Camilla made her final attempt to change his mind. Witnesses say her voice trembled as she begged to stand by her husband on the day that defined the nation. But Charles's eyes were cold. The king who once defied the world for her love now refused to even hear her name at the ceremony. The tension that had been building for weeks finally reached its breaking point that evening. The doors of Clarence's house were closed to outsiders, but those who served within spoke of an atmosphere so heavy it was almost unbearable. Camilla had waited, hoping the king's heart would soften, that reason would prevail over duty. When she finally entered his private quarters, she was not the confident queen consort the public saw, but a woman desperate to save what remained of their bond. Her voice wavered as she pleaded, reminding him of the years they had endured together, the isolation, the criticism, the endless scrutiny. "You and I fought the world for this," she said softly. "Don't erase me now." But Charles stood unmoved. The man who had once written her love letters now could barely look her in the eye. Advisors stationed outside the room exchanged anxious glances. Some whispered that the argument had grown so heated they considered stepping in, afraid of what such confrontation might mean if leaked to the press. Yet none dared to interrupt. They knew this was not a mere marital disagreement, it was history colliding with regret. Inside, Camilla's tone shifted from sorrow to fury. Years of restraint crumbled as she accused him of sacrificing their marriage to satisfy his mother's ghost. "You're killing me for her approval," she cried, her voice echoing through the marble halls. For a long moment, Charles said nothing. Then, in a voice quiet but sharp enough to pierce through the silence, he answered, "It's not my approval," she demands. "It's my repentance." Those 6 words shattered what little hope remained between them. Camilla froze. She realized, in that instant, that this wasn't about the memorial anymore, it was about absolution. Charles wasn't punishing her out of cruelty, he was punishing himself. The guilt of decades past, the echoes of scandal, and the haunting disapproval of the late queen had fused into one unbearable burden. He had become a man, imprisoned by his own promise, chained to an oath no one could see, but everyone could feel. The confrontation didn't end with anger, it ended with silence. Charles turned away from her, his expression unreadable, his shoulders weighed down by a sorrow he could no longer voice. Camilla stood motionless, realizing that the man she had fought to crown had already slipped beyond her reach. When he finally spoke again, it was only to dismiss her gently, his tone as formal as if addressing a courtier, not a wife. "The matter is settled," he said. "You will not attend." With those words, a lifetime of shared battles, of passion-defying protocol, dissolved into formality. As Camilla left the room, the advisors who had once rallied behind her lowered their eyes, too fearful to meet her gaze. She had entered Clarence's house as a queen, but she left it as an exile within her own marriage. Behind the grandeur of royal walls, the woman once called the love of his life was now a symbol of forbidden guilt. And yet, as she wept behind those closed doors, unaware of what was unfolding beyond them, something unexpected began to stir within the palace ranks. But while Camilla wept behind palace walls, someone else had already taken her side, and their move would shake the monarchy again. Known as the most loyal defender of royal tradition, Princess Anne stunned everyone by standing up for the one woman her mother never forgave. "This isn't what she would have wanted," Anne told Charles in a tone only a sister could use. But what did she really mean? Was Anne protecting Camilla, or preserving the monarchy's fragile illusion of unity? When word reached Anne that Camilla had been barred from the memorial, she didn't react with outrage or sympathy. She simply went quiet. Those who know her say Princess Royal's silence is never casual. Within hours, she requested a private audience with the king, one that even his closest advisors weren't allowed to attend. Behind those closed doors, the atmosphere was tense, but not hostile. For all their differences, Charles and Anne had shared a lifetime of unspoken understanding. She wasn't there to challenge his authority, she was there to question his judgment. "You've done what Mother warned us never to do," she said evenly, her voice low but unwavering. "You've made it personal." Charles tried to defend his decision, but Anne's words cut deeper than any political advice could. She reminded him that their mother's greatest strength had been her restraint, her ability to act without emotion, even when her heart was breaking. Anne's appeal was not sentimental, It was strategic. "You're not just excluding your wife," she told him. "You're undermining the institution." For a monarch barely a year into his reign, that accusation carried enormous weight. She knew the pressure he was under, the grief he was still carrying, but she also knew how fragile the public's perception of the monarchy had become. Her plea was simple, yet powerful. Compassion, not punishment, must guide the crown. For a brief moment, it seemed her words had reached him. Memories of their mother flooded Charles's mind. The moments when Elizabeth had leaned on Anne for reason and balance, the trust she had placed in her daughter to preserve the royal family's image when emotions ran high. It was Anne who had been called the family's backbone, the one Elizabeth turned to when others faltered. Now, standing before her brother, she was playing that role again, trying to stop him from making a decision that could fracture the family beyond repair. But beneath her composure, Anne carried her own fears. She knew that defending Camilla, even in principle, meant defying their mother's memory. Still, she did it anyway. Her warning was sharp and pragmatic. She spoke not as a sister, but as the monarchy's strategist. "The press already smells blood," she said. "Once they see division, they'll feast on it. And this time, they won't stop at Camilla." She reminded him that a public rift over the Queen's memorial would invite chaos, questions about loyalty, whispers of instability, and the dreaded narrative of another Windsor war. Her caution wasn't exaggerated. Reporters had already caught wind of Camilla's absence, and were spinning theories about a family feud behind palace gates. Anne's intervention was not just an act of compassion, it was damage control. She wanted to protect the crown, even if it meant defending someone she never fully trusted. For the first time in weeks, Charles hesitated. The hardness in his eyes softened, if only briefly. The part of him that still valued family over formality flickered back to life. He looked at Anne, seeking reassurance, for permission to let go of the bitterness consuming him. But before he could answer, one of his senior aides knocked an interruption that would shift everything. The press office had just received new leaks, headlines suggesting the royal family was divided over the Queen's memorial. Anonymous sources claimed Anne was pleading with the king to show mercy. Within hours, this rumor would spread worldwide. Anne had meant to protect him. Instead, her intervention had become ammunition for the very chaos she tried to prevent. And as the whispers grew, so did Charles's sense of betrayal. The unity he fought to preserve was crumbling in real time, and he could no longer tell who was truly on his side. Yet, just as the tension began to ease, a shocking new revelation would push Charles past the point of forgiveness. Buried deep in the archives of Windsor Castle lay a letter Queen Elizabeth never intended the public to see. When Charles read it, everything changed. The words, penned years before her death, mentioned a betrayal closer than blood. For the king, it was proof that his mother's warnings had come true and that Camilla had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The discovery came by accident. Palace archivists were cataloging personal correspondence for the royal archives when one stumbled upon a sealed envelope marked, "Private for my son's eyes only." It was dated nearly a decade before Elizabeth's passing, written in her unmistakable, firm handwriting. No one dared open it without royal permission. The moment Charles was informed, he demanded it be brought directly to him. What he read inside would send shockwaves through the monarchy. The Queen had written of her fears, not about politics or the press, but about betrayal, one that she foresaw from within. The letter was clear in tone yet hauntingly vague, warning her son that those closest to you may someday bring dishonor to the crown. But it was the following lines that broke him. "There is one who understands loyalty as power, not duty. Guard your heart, my son, for love can be the kingdom's undoing." At first Charles dismissed it as his mother's cautious wisdom, but attached to the letter was something far more damning. An addendum written by a private secretary at Elizabeth's request, summarizing an incident she had investigated quietly during her reign. It hinted at financial irregularities tied to charitable funds overseen by Camilla's office, money redirected in ways that blurred the line between royal duty and personal comfort. There was no direct accusation, but enough implication to ignite suspicion. To Charles, Already wounded by months of emotional turmoil, it felt like confirmation. His mother had seen it all. Those who were in the room when he read it said his face changed completely. The sorrow that had shadowed him for weeks hardened into rage. He read the letter twice, then folded it carefully, his hands trembling not with grief, but fury. "She shamed the crown in mother's eyes," he murmured, pacing the length of the room. For a man who had spent his entire life trying to live up to the image of the late queen, this revelation felt like a personal betrayal. Every argument, every doubt about Camilla that had haunted him since the memorial plans began, now crystallized into a single, devastating truth. His mother had warned him, and he had failed to listen. Confidants close to the king say what followed was unlike anything they had ever seen. The man known for his calm restraint erupted in anger behind closed doors. Documents were thrown aside, staff dismissed in tears. Advisors tried to calm him, to remind him that the letter's contents could be misinterpreted, that it might not mean what he feared, but Charles had made up his mind. To him, this wasn't about proof, it was about perception. And perception was everything. His mother's legacy was being stained, and he would not let it happen under his reign. Within hours, a quiet but decisive order was issued. The exclusion of the queen consort from the memorial was not to be revisited. Palace officials were instructed to proceed as planned, with every trace of her presence removed from official arrangements. For Charles, this was no longer a marital dispute. It was an act of purification, a symbolic severing of the past from the future. In his mind, by keeping Camilla away from the memorial, he was restoring balance to a monarchy that had drifted from its moral center. It was the final expression of loyalty to his mother, the woman who had built the institution he now ruled, and whose judgment he could no longer question. That night, while the palace slept, Charles sat alone, the letter resting beside him. The silence of Windsor echoed with ghosts his mother's voice, his guilt, his fear that love had indeed become the kingdom's undoing. Outside, preparations continued for the memorial, the most solemn event of his reign. Invitations were confirmed, routes secured, seating plans redrawn to reflect the sudden absence of a queen. As dawn rose over Westminster, the royal motorcade moved, without her, and Britain braced itself for the spectacle no one imagined possible. While the nation bowed in silence, one seat remained empty, a seat that should have belonged to the queen consort. Cameras captured Charles's stoic face, but insiders whispered that his heart was breaking beneath the crown. Across town, Camilla watched the broadcast alone, tears streaming as the world witnessed her public erasure. The morning of the memorial began with an eerie calm that blanketed Westminster Abbey. Crowds lined the streets, their flags folded respectfully, their expressions solemn as the bells tolled. Yet, behind the grandeur of the ceremony, a silent tension rippled through the palace and the press alike. The world had noticed the absence. There was no queen consort by the king's side. Every journalist, every commentator, every guest whispered the same question: where is Camilla? The palace's official statement had said nothing beyond private circumstances, but the vagueness only deepened the intrigue. For many, it was unthinkable that on this day of this historic commemoration of Queen Elizabeth's legacy, the new queen would not be present. Foreign dignitaries exchanged curious glances as they took their seats. The cameras swept across the royal pews, capturing every face but one. The absence was loud, echoing louder than the choir's hymns. When the king entered, every step he took seemed heavier than the last. The world saw a man composed and regal, but those close enough could sense the storm beneath the surface. He walked past the empty chair reserved beside him, a symbolic space left unoccupied, and for the briefest moment, his hand hesitated, his breath caught. Those who watched closely swore they saw the slightest tremor in his composure, a flicker of pain he could not conceal. It was a glimpse of the man behind the monarch, the husband who had silenced the woman he once called the love of his life. Beside him, Prince William stood tall, his face a portrait of restraint. But even he could not mask the sorrow that lingered in his eyes. He knew his father's decision had come at a terrible price not only to the family's unity, but to the fragile balance of power within the monarchy itself. As the choir's voices rose in reverence to the late queen, William's glance briefly met his father's. It was not anger he felt, but quiet pity. The burden of the crown had finally caught up with the man who had spent his life waiting for it. Then came the moment that broke even the most composed hearts in the abbey. A massive projection illuminated the hall, showing rare footage of Queen Elizabeth's first coronation oath, a young monarch pledging her life to service, duty, and faith. The audience rose to their feet in remembrance, but Charles remained seated, his gaze fixed on the flickering image of his mother. It was said that, in that instant, his face softened not in pride, but in grief. Perhaps he saw himself reflected in her sacrifice. Perhaps he saw the weight of her legacy pressing on him more than ever. Across London, Camilla sat alone in the Clarence House salon, the ceremony playing live on the television. The woman who had endured decades of ridicule now faced the greatest humiliation of all public invisibility. Every headline that flashed across the broadcast reminded her of what had been taken from her. The Queen Consort missing from memorial. Royal unity cracks in public view. The empty seat that shocked the world. Tears fell freely as she whispered words no one would hear, a plea not of defiance, but of despair. When the final hymn faded and the abbey doors opened once more, Britain exhaled in collective silence. Yet, outside those walls, the storm had already begun. Reporters flooded social media with speculation. Was this a deliberate exile, a punishment, or the start of something much darker within the palace? Commentators dissected every second of the king's expression, every turn of his head, every hesitant glance at the vacant chair beside him. What the nation had witnessed wasn't just a memorial, it was a monarchy exposing its fracture lines in plain sight. And as the royal motorcade departed Westminster, the image of that empty chair remained burned into the public's mind as a silent symbol of betrayal, loss, and power. For Charles, it was the culmination of his mother's will. For Camilla, it was the moment her crown turned to dust. But neither could see what was coming next. The fallout was only beginning, because what happened after the ceremony would rewrite the balance of power within the royal household. Social media erupted. "Where is Camilla?" trended worldwide. For the first time since his coronation, Charles faced open rebellion not from politicians, but from the people. Meanwhile, Camilla's allies within the court began leaking stories that threatened to destroy the king's reputation forever. The memorial had barely concluded when the backlash began. Within minutes, social media platforms exploded with outrage and disbelief. Hashtags calling for transparency flooded timelines. Royal commentators who once praised Charles now questioned his judgment. "The king silences his queen," read one headline. "History repeats itself," said another. In homes across Britain and abroad, conversations turned accusatory, fueled by clips from the broadcast showing that unmistakable empty seat beside the king. What had started as quiet curiosity now erupted into a full-blown scandal, shaking the foundations of the monarchy's carefully maintained image. The institution, known for its mastery of silence, suddenly found itself cornered by the noise of a global public demanding answers. Camilla's allies struck back swiftly. A handful of well-connected friends, former staffers, social acquaintances, and even one discreet confidant still employed in the palace began whispering to select journalists. Their message was clear. The Queen Consort had been humiliated, isolated, and emotionally shattered by a king consumed with guilt and control. Anonymous quotes appeared in tabloids claiming she had endured years of emotional punishment masked as royal duty. One insider described Clarence House as a cold battlefield, where affection had long been replaced by duty and regret. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or not no longer mattered. The damage was done. The king's silence only deepened the perception that he had something to hide. By nightfall, new allegations surfaced, this time far more dangerous. Leaked recordings, allegedly from within the palace itself, captured tense exchanges between senior aides debating whether the king's mental state had become unstable following the rediscovered letter from Queen Elizabeth. "He's unraveling," one voice claimed. "He's obsessed with her ghost." The authenticity of the recordings could not be verified, but the story spread like wildfire. News networks around the world ran it as breaking news, their anchors using words like crisis, meltdown, and collapse. What had been a story about exclusion had transformed into a narrative of royal implosion. Inside Kensington Palace, William and Catherine watched events unfold with growing alarm. Though loyal to the crown, they understood the stakes better than anyone. William, protective yet pragmatic, urged his father to issue a clear public statement. Catherine, always measured, tried to reassure palace staff that unity was still possible. But even their calm could not stop the storm. Every effort at quiet damage control seemed too late. By the next morning, the monarchy's approval ratings had plummeted to levels unseen since the 1990 seconds. The ghost of Diana's public sympathy had returned, and this time it wore Camilla's face. Under immense pressure, Charles made another drastic decision. Camilla would be moved permanently to a private residence outside London, away from royal functions and public scrutiny. Officially, it was described as a temporary retreat for health and rest. But everyone knew better. It was exile disguised as compassion. Aides described the king as withdrawn, issuing orders in clipped tones, refusing visitors. The man who once promised transparency now hid behind palace gates, surrounded by advisors more concerned with optics than truth. When the palace finally released an official statement, it only worsened the chaos. It offered sympathy for Her Majesty's need for privacy, but made no mention of reconciliation or future appearances. The ambiguity was damning. To the public, it confirmed everything they feared, that the marriage was fractured, and that the king was punishing his queen for reasons far deeper than anyone understood. And as the headlines grew more brutal, as reporters circled every royal residence, and as supporters of the late queen began to question the very heart of the crown, one thing became clear. This was no longer about appearances. It was about survival. But behind closed doors, Charles knew the truth. His decision wasn't just about Camilla. It was about the monarchy's soul, and one final act would decide its fate. As silence returned to Buckingham Palace, the king who once defied the world for love now sat alone in his study, staring at his mother's portrait. He had won the battle for tradition but lost the woman who once completed him. Those close to him say his final words that night were simple: "I kept her wish and broke my heart." The grand halls that once echoed with royal footsteps had fallen still. The chaos outside had quieted, but within the palace, the silence was deafening. In the aftermath of the memorial and the public storm that followed, King Charles withdrew from everyone, his advisors, his family, even the loyal few who had served him since his youth. He spent hours behind closed doors, lost in reflection, as if waiting for the ghost of his mother to speak once more. To the staff who passed his study late at night, the sight was haunting. The king seated in solitude, head bowed, surrounded by shadows and memories. The man who had spent a lifetime yearning for the throne now found the crown to be the heaviest burden of all. Those closest to the king began to notice the change almost immediately. His once measured tone grew distant, his interactions mechanical. Advisors described him as there, but not present. He would sit through briefings without comment, nodding absently, his thoughts elsewhere. Even routine matters of state seemed to carry no interest for him. When pressed on matters concerning the monarchy's image or the growing public sympathy for Camilla, he merely replied, "It will pass. Everything does." But those words lacked conviction. Behind that quiet stoicism lay exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man torn between duty and love, haunted by the knowledge that, in fulfilling one vow, he had broken another. Meanwhile, Camilla retreated to Ray Mill House, the quiet country house where she had once sought refuge during the darkest years of their affair. For the first time, the British public, long divided in their opinion of her, seemed to lean in her favor. Photos of her leaving Clarence House alone circulated in the press, accompanied by sympathetic headlines describing her as the Queen cast aside. For a woman long accustomed to hostility, the irony was cruel. She had finally earned public empathy, but at the cost of her marriage. Friends said she refused to speak Charles's name, referring to him only as the king, as if he were no longer the man she once loved. Inside Buckingham Palace, Queen Elizabeth's legacy loomed larger than ever. Every portrait, every corridor, every whisper carried her presence. Some courtiers even confessed that it felt as though she still ruled in spirit, guiding decisions from beyond the grave. For Charles, that lingering influence became both his compass and his curse. He believed he had upheld her wishes, preserved her legacy, and safeguarded the crown's sanctity. Yet, each time he looked into her painted eyes, he felt the weight of what that loyalty had cost him. The palace may have regained its order, but its king had lost his peace. And as weeks turned into months, cracks began to show within the royal household. The unity that had once held the family together now trembled under quiet resentment. William's respect for his father was laced with concern, Anne's loyalty tempered by disapproval, and the courtiers whispered about the growing isolation of a monarch burdened by guilt. The monarchy stood steady in appearance but fragile in spirit, its foundation built not on confidence but on concealment. Even the public could sense it. Every royal engagement, every photo of Charles smiling beneath the crown, carried a sadness that no ceremony could hide. In his final hours before retreating for the night, the king would often sit alone in the same room where his mother once worked. Those who glimpsed him through the half-open door said he would occasionally speak softly to her portrait, as though confessing sins to a silent judge. One aide claimed to have overheard him whisper, "I did what you asked, Mummy, but at what cost?" Whether the words were real or imagined, no one could say. What was certain, however, was that the man who had fought so long to prove himself worthy of his mother's crown now found it impossible to live beneath its weight. And as the candlelight flickered in those empty halls, the monarchy seemed poised on the edge of yet another reckoning, not of scandal or politics, but of legacy. For if the Queen had been the nation's conscience, Charles had become its reminder that even kings cannot escape consequence. His decision had preserved the monarchy's image, but at the price of its heart, and so, the question lingers in every corridor of the palace. Did King Charles save his mother's legacy, or destroy his own in the process? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.